Will City, Self-Care Sunday. Yo, I'm like self-care on Sundays with a day off on Monday. Private jet on the runway, taking off, going one way to the top. Whoa. Who said the sky is the limit when I'm high is my vision? On Facebook Live, going live in a minute. Don't mind me, I'm just minding my business. Breaking news, doing interviews, but it's not about me, I'm doing this for you. Matter of fact, no, I'm doing this for proof that a self-care Sundays and dreams come true. They really do.
Hi, everyone, and welcome to another episode of the Self-Care Sundays podcast. We are excited for this week's guest, Nneka Okona. But before we get started, I wanted to ask for your help supporting the podcast via Patreon. Patreon allows supporters of the show to donate a monthly amount to help with our costs, including monthly maintenance fees and to pay our audio engineer. If you'd like to help us out, please check out patreon.com/selfcaresundayspodcast. That's patreon.com/selfcaresundayspodcast. Thank you in advance. It's the generosity of our listeners that helps this information become accessible to so many people in the first place. So let's get started. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well. How about yourself?
I'm doing well. So the question we're starting this season with, that's kind of our open-ended question, is what are your self-care habits and how did you develop them?
That's a really good question. I really don't think that for a long time, I didn't know what self-care really was. With a lot of people that I know that I talk to who have developed like self-care rituals and things that kind of sustain them. But for me, I think what really that was a tipping point for me in terms of learning to really take care of myself in a way that I hadn't before was about 4 years ago. And I had just moved back stateside to Washington, D.C. after living in Madrid for about a year. And I was struggling, adjusting with everything, being in a new region because I'm from Atlanta in the South. And new region, I was trying to find work because I hadn't worked in terms of like within a full-time capacity for a year. I was teaching English in Madrid and trying to find friends. And it was just like really, really, really difficult. And on top of that, I was living with my dad. So that was another huge adjustment. So I ended up like really, really, really depressed after that, just floundering and trying to adjust to all the different changes and just really struggling with it. So I started therapy for the first time ever. And that was really daunting, really scary, but it ended up making a huge leap for me in terms of learning to take care of myself. So I think for me, one of the first ways I learned in terms of self-care was therapy and going to someone that I trusted and having them give me feedback, having someone hold me accountable for changes that I wanted to make, being in a space that is safe for healing. And ever since I did therapy, from there, it was just a lot of other little supplemental things that I added on top of that. But I think for me, self-care started with therapy, and that was always like the definition that it came to mean for me, if that makes sense.
Yeah, totally. So what were therapy is something that I at least view as like a learning tool, but it's not like necessarily the thing that helps you take care of yourself. I've often viewed therapy as like a place you go to like learn how to do that better, and to have like assistance with that, because no one really teaches you how to be thoughtful about your mental and emotional well-being. So I'm wondering, through therapy, what were those kind of supplemental, as you refer to them, habits that you developed that allowed you to sustain yourself on a day-to-day basis?
Well, I realized that one of the things that I really struggled with was actually viewing myself as being someone who was good enough, and that translating into my work and how I saw myself in like my friendships and relationships with other people. So one of the things that I spent a lot of time talking about in therapy was learning how to affirm myself. And that was kind of a tool that I'd never really known how to develop, nor was it really mirrored to me growing up either. So, from there, I kind of started doing morning pages. So, which ended up for me being.
Can you tell us what that is?
So, morning pages essentially is supposed to be a space where you dump. Like you give yourself 3 pages and it's stream of consciousness writing. So you just dump, unload, empty yourself of what you're thinking about, what you're feeling about, what you're tussling with. And it kind of opens you up to a lot more creativity. Her name is Julia. I'm forgetting her last name. but she's known for creating this concept of morning pages. I forgot her last name, but I don't remember who told me about that book, but like I learned about it around the same time that I started therapy. So I started journaling, and I'm not really a morning person, so it ended up being like afternoon pages for me personally. And that was really helpful because it gave me a space to kind of realize what was in my head. Mm-hmm. That I didn't realize that I was focusing on so heavily. Like I would write it and I wouldn't like look at it right away. Usually I would look at it maybe a couple days later and be like, oh, that's really interesting, because I didn't know that bothered me that much. That was one way. Another way, my diet. Cooking more. I've always cooked a lot. I've been cooking since I was 9. So starting to fuel myself with better food and cooking more from scratch was really huge for me, because in the past, like I kind of like cooked a lot of like processed stuff and it was like really quick and heavy things, but I started to really take the time to make myself more sustaining meals, and that became like a huge healing space for me too. When you think about nourishing yourself and filling yourself with certain things, so being able to give myself really good food that made me feel good was important. What else?
And how did you develop those habits? Are you a person who's like very disciplined, and so once you decided to do it, you just did it? Or was there some backslide? Did you have people who kind of held you accountable? How did you develop these habits?
I'm innately very disciplined. When I set out to do something, it doesn't take much for me to do it. But I think what did also help is having friends around me who were committed to taking better care of themselves as well. So around that time when I started therapy, I had like a lot of other friends who started therapy around the same time. And we were just kind of in that space where we were kind of having like really open and vulnerable conversations about other things that we needed to do to take care of ourselves. So that helped too, having community. But yeah, I'm very, very disciplined when it comes to most things.
So it's interesting. I know that you've written some about food. You had a piece on jollof rice as a Nigerian-American. And I'm wondering about how you kind of think about like health and nourishing food and cooking from scratch. And then what, at least in my experience, like the challenges of like trying to sometimes cook like traditional food and connecting to your roots and being like, this is actually not super healthy. And I wonder if you've experienced any tension with those things.
Sometimes, yeah, because like Nigerian food innately in some ways is not really healthy. It's very starch heavy. I mean, it's that kind of food that is really like, it sticks to your rib kind of food. Like you eat that, you feel really comforted, but it's also very heavy. And that usually is not something that I want to eat when for instance, if I'm working, because in terms of like being a freelance writer, if I eat Nigerian food at 2 or 3 o'clock for lunch, then I'm not going to be able to work for the rest of the day because like it's so heavy. Mm-hmm. So usually when I do eat it or cook it, it's like dinner, the last meal of the day when I'm pretty much wrapped up with working and that sort of thing. And I'm not really counting to be productive for any real reason. But it can be difficult because I'm half Nigerian. My dad's from Lagos. My mother's from Huntsville, Alabama. So I learned how to cook Nigerian food and like traditional Southern food, and both can be in many ways like very heavy sometimes. Mm-hmm. So making, I guess, like healthier adjustments has been interesting. Swapping out frying a lot of things for roasting. That's typically when I'm cooking veggies, I tend to roast them. I don't really saute or fry them anymore, just because one, it's a little bit unhealthy, and two, it just is so much work. Frying anything is too much work. So it's easy to just like put the oven on 425, toss it with some extra virgin olive oil, salt and pepper, and put it in the oven for 15 minutes and you're done. Like that's really easy. But yeah.
No, so it's interesting. It's like actually some of the healthier options are actually easier options.
Yeah.
And we're like, why were we doing this to ourselves?
I don't know. It's really ironic.
That's funny. And so you mentioned that you're a freelance writer, and I'm wondering about, you have said that you're disciplined, but I'm wondering about kind of your day-to-day schedule, and like, because you don't have to be anywhere at a specific time, I'm wondering if you have a schedule that you've created for yourself, if you build in these routines to your day-to-day life, if you could just tell us a little bit about that.
Yes. So being a freelance writer has been like a lot of trial and error because you are pretty much at your own whims. You have to create a structure. I thought for a long while that having the freedom of freelance, because I used to work in a newsroom many years ago. I started in newspapers, working in newsrooms. So that was like my career for a long while until I just kind of got tired of it and started to like really just create my own career that fit my life better, because I wanted the flexibility and freedom to travel a lot more than I was being. You can't travel as much as you want to. You only get 2 weeks of vacation at work. So one of the really key things that I realized when it came to building up my days as a freelancer is noticing my energy and productivity levels and around what time of day. Now, when I worked in a newsroom, I typically had to be at work around 8:30 or 9 o'clock and then leave around 5. But I noticed after a while that I wouldn't really get anything done until like 1 or 2 in the afternoon. And after then, I was like super, super productive. But before then, it was just like pulling teeth. And from there, that was a really aha moment for me. I realized that I'm not a morning person. It just doesn't happen for me. And once I kind of accepted that for myself, it made me a lot more productive and I was able to get a lot more work done versus forcing myself to get up at really early, because they tell writers, oh, if you're a writer, you have to get up really early and start writing. And I'm like, that has never been me. So I honored just like what worked for me. And morning, my brain does not work for much. So usually in the mornings, I wake up around 9 or 10. One of the first things I do in the morning is I like to, I started doing tarot for myself recently. So that is like another new thing that I've added into like my self-care, because every now and then I've noticed like I need like some sort of morning routine to kind of get me in the flow. For a while, it was just I would start off with a pot of tea, like put the tea kettle on once I woke up and then just kind of sit in silence for 5 minutes. And then after then I would start and do whatever. But that got kind of stale for me. So then I switched into tarot. So I do tarot journaling in the morning. I pull like 3 cards and then I just like write down what the meanings of the cards have for me and kind of reflect and think about what that's saying for me in my life personally. I use it as more of like intuitive guidance and it resonates with me and it helps me and it kind of gets me in the frame of mind for how I want to spend that day and what to really look out for, to focus on. From there, I typically do like just maintenance things, grocery shopping, cooking, answering emails, sending off invoices, things that don't require a lot of mental energy. And around 1 or 2 or 3, just depending on how long it takes for me to wrap up the other things, then I usually start writing. So
that's really interesting. And so you mentioned that you do travel writing. And I think that people have a notion of travel writing as being kind of glamorous in some way. And I know that you've tried to dispel that myth a little bit.
I try to as much as often, but I don't think people believe me.
So I wanted to offer the forum to kind of discuss, because so in the first season of Self-Care Sundays, we talked a lot about privilege and self-care. And so I think it's important that, travel is a really wonderful way to learn and to grow and to change. And there has been, I don't know if it's accurate to say a renaissance, but there has at least been a lot more kind of structured organizations focusing on Black travel and Black people traveling, Black Americans specifically traveling. And I'm wondering kind of if you can kind of tell us a little bit about what the life of a travel writer is and where you think the notion of it being kind of a privileged existence comes from and what the reality is and how self-care factors into all of that.
I think the notion that travel writing and travel in general is privilege is because it is. To be able to travel like I do, like I think about that constantly. It is a huge privilege. Part of the reason being that I have disposable income to do it. I'm not married. I don't have any kids. So there are not like a lot of restrictions for me personally. For me, travel, it became so very important to me that it became a priority and that I prioritize it above a lot of other things in terms of spending my money that a lot of people probably wouldn't feel comfortable doing. And that's just a personal choice that I've made. And whenever people tell me, oh my gosh, how do you travel so much? And da da da. And it's like, well, one of the things is, like I said, like it is a privilege and I don't have like a lot really tying me down to any one location. But also it's just because like when I think about how I want to spend my money, like travel is almost always at the very top of my list. So it just, for me, I think of it that way. But in terms of travel writing, I started travel writing about 4 years ago, around the same time when I moved back stateside after living in Madrid. So this was the fall of 2014. And I had been blogging for a while, for about a year. And my blog kind of got the attention of a lot of people because I kind of stated it as being like a Black and African woman's adventure or experiences traveling. And I thought that was really, really important because I think when people think of Spain, they don't really think about what it is really like to be a Black or African person living in Spain. It's a very different experience as a person of color living in Spain. And my blog is called Afros y Paella.
Where's the name from?
So paella is like a traditional Spanish dish. Afros being like Black or African. So I just kind of made something up. Mm-hmm. But it stuck and it's catchy and it just kind of combined two things into one. So I actually use my travel blog as clips to start writing for travel publications. My first clip that I ever had was just Travel and Leisure. And I wrote about luxury hostels. So that was actually how I started travel writing. The editor of Travel and Leisure back then, she's no longer with them. She works for Pop Science now, actually, which is random. But she tweeted, I'm looking for travel writers and blah, blah, blah. So I sent her an email and the next day we had a phone call and she's like, I think you'd be great. And then the rest was pretty much history, as they say. So that's how I started travel writing. And travel writing as a Black woman, as an African woman, is very interesting because it's a very white space. So I find a lot of frustration personally in telling the different stories that I actually want to tell, because when I travel, what really speaks to me is seeing global iterations of Blackness and the African diaspora. Like, that's what speaks to me personally. Like, I find that interesting. If I can go in the middle of Peru and I can learn about these African people who lived here centuries ago and this is what they ate and this is what they did, that's interesting to me. It makes me feel more connected to the world around me and it resonates with me, and that's what I want to write about. But typically, that's not what travel publications are looking to publish. So it becomes this really frustrating space where you realize that a lot of publications they're gearing towards like the white gaze when you talk about travel. And then when you talk about the white gaze in travel, you talk about like colonization and white supremacy and how like travel is viewed as a very white experience. So like what you were saying earlier about like the Renaissance of Black travel, it essentially is debunking that entire theory that Black people don't travel. And yeah, we always have traveled. We have. And I think for me, it's important for me to just unearth those stories that no one is telling, but it can be really difficult to do that.
So not to ask a rude question, but like as a travel writer, if you're traveling somewhere to write a piece, does the outlet usually cover your travel costs?
Typically, no. So right now I'm actually in Colombia, in Medellin, and I'm financing this myself. But usually the way that a lot of travel writers finance their trips and the way that they're able to travel are what are called press trips. And essentially what that means is either like a PR firm or a brand will reach out to you. This started happening to me like maybe a couple years ago. I randomly was just getting emails from people inviting me to go different places. And I was just like, what is happening? So, and then once that happened, I realized that was how a lot of the people that I knew, well, I would say white people that I knew that were doing travel writing, that was how they were able to travel so much and without expensing it themselves. So that's what a lot of travel writers do. Now, it kind of is like a tricky kind of thing within the industry because the New York Times says things like, if you've done like a press trip within a certain amount of years, you can't write for us. But people really do a lot of times operate on the don't ask, don't tell policy in terms of like with travel publications. And then again, you're kind of running into the thing, like you said, about privilege. if you're only letting people who can afford to expense trips around the world, what kind of coverage are you getting? You're getting the same 5 or 6 privileged people who can afford it. And what kind of travel coverage does that make? So not everyone can afford to do that. So that's why I think when people are always talking about like it's an ethical thing, and it's just, okay, so again, we need to talk about diversifying travel perspectives and making it like more inclusive, because not everyone can afford to do this. So travel press trips kind of, they level the playing field in terms of access, is what I've always thought.
No, that makes a lot of sense. And I didn't actually even know that existed. So that's really interesting to kind of learn more about industries that like I'm a lot less familiar with. So in addition to travel and food, you also have written articles about grief and loss. And I'm wondering why those areas and how you've kind of learned and developed your self-care through those experiences, which are universal experiences. But I'm curious why you're writing, like there are lots of things to write about. Why kind of have you operated in these areas?
Well, food has like always been like an integral part of my life. I've been cooking since I was 9, and being both a Black Southerner and a Nigerian raised in the South, food was one of the lenses that I used to understand my identity. So that's why it became so huge for me. And travel became like a way that I was able to connect much deeply with myself and to see Blackness, like I said, Blackness iterated throughout the world. I feel more connected when I see that in different places. And in some cases, I would say that travel acts as self-care for me, because it gives me a sometimes emotional perspective, and that helps me in some ways. But in terms of grief and loss, there's a very specific reason that I started writing about it recently. Last August, I was actually in Bogota. So that was like my first trip to Colombia. And I found out that a really good friend of mine had died in a car accident. She was 30 years old, and it was completely shocking. And to learn that, I found out we went to the same grad school. So like we went to the same program where we learned how to write, and it was comparable to the MFA program we met there. And the listserv that we're all on sent an email about like the accident. And I was just like, what the hell? Like, you're never really prepared for that kind of news. So from there, I just kind of wanted to start openly talking about grief and what it looks like and what it feels like, because I feel like our society in many ways gets grief wrong. We're not really open about the ways that we talk about it. And I really struggle with it within like what they would psychologists call early grief. So like the first 90 days, I really struggle with it because I felt like people had these expectations of how I should have been coping with my loss. And that wasn't how I was dealing with it. So it was really stressful for me. And from then, I learned that with grief, you kind of just have to give people the space to navigate their grief on their own way. No one copes with it the same way. And then to be careful to just not isolate people when they're grieving, because for me, it was a very isolating experience because, like I said, people had these expectations of how I should have been coping. People were telling me everything happens for a reason. And I'm just like, no, it doesn't. That's stupid. Don't tell me that. So I'm actually working on quite a few more essays on grief that I have just been tussling with, as I navigate my grief journey. So I'm hoping to just kind of give people the space to feel more open talking about their grief. There have been a lot of people, as I've been tweeting and writing about it, who've reached out to me thanking me for talking about it. So I think things like that happen. I know that I'm doing the right thing.
Do you find that writing for you ends up becoming like a self-care practice? You mentioned that, food has been part of your identity, and like this, your writing on grief and loss came out of a very specific experience. Do you find it to be useful to you in helping you kind of think through what's going on in your life?
I think it can, but I think I've learned in like really difficult situations that the writing that kind of helps me make sense of it for myself emotionally comes a little after, because right after my friend died, I didn't really write that much. I didn't write for maybe 3 months. I just stopped writing because it was too painful for me. And so eventually when I was kind of in a space when I was ready to start facing what I felt, then I started writing again. So it's interesting for me to think about like writing being self-care, because it is, but not usually immediately. It's usually a little bit past when I've processed things, if that makes sense.
Yeah, so once you're done with once you're moving out of the feeling and into some of the thinking.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. And we've talked about this a bit, but I am curious how you think about how your identity informs how you practice self-care.
Yeah, it's really interesting because like when I said that I didn't know what self-care was, I literally did not know because I didn't grow up seeing people who practiced it at all. And even still, if I were to think about like family and things that were mirrored to me, and I think when we talk about self-care, a lot of the times how and when we learn to practice self-care comes from what we see mirrored as a child. If we don't see it, it can become very difficult for us to kind of arrive at a point where we start to practice it and figure out what works for us. But for me, culturally, like being first generation Nigerian-American, like that, self-care is not taught and it's not important because, especially me, I'm the oldest in my family. Being the oldest, you have a lot of pressure and a lot of responsibility kind of thrown on you, and it's expected that you're selfless and you never think of yourself. You always think of everyone else. So kind of thinking about self-care was very difficult for me too initially because it was a lot of culture clashing. I started thinking, how can I reconcile honoring my heritage and who I come from and where I come from and what's important to me and what I've been taught to be with what I need for myself personally. That was very difficult, and it still remains very difficult for me too. Because like I said, like there are certain expectations as a Nigerian, as a first generation immigrant child, like you have a parent who sacrificed so much for you to be here. And so like it becomes kind of like a little bit of guilt. I'm taking care of myself. I'm not centering 50 other people. Does that make me a bad person? I don't really have the answers for it because like I find myself kind of figuring out different levels of it as I get older, but it's definitely culture kind of really does factor into self-care in a very interesting way for me personally.
Yeah, it's interesting because a lot of, like you mentioned travel as self-care, and it seems that and I fully believe you that like these are things I think we all wrestle with, but it does seem that you have in your actions managed to find a way to like feel comfortable prioritizing what's important to you and remove some of the guilt from it.
Yeah, it's been a journey, and sometimes I do feel that the little twinge of guilt, not as much as I used to, but it's an ever growing process to kind of realize, okay, you can only help others as much as you help yourself. If I'm not taking care of myself, I really can't help anyone else. So when I remember that, it becomes a lot easier to prioritize myself and what I need and when I need it.
Yeah, it's interesting. Do you have kind of these other self-talk things that you mentioned that you're naturally quite disciplined? Like, are there things that you kind of do as self-talk to be like, all right, I need to do my pages, or I need to really get up and like cook this meal? Like, do you kind of have a self-talk or an internal narrative that helps you when you're maybe not feeling as motivated?
I do. And it's not a very, although I am disciplined, it's not a very like, I'm trying to think of the word. It's not one of those voices that's just like very like aggressive or rude or suggestive. Initially, when I did start therapy 4 years ago, I realized that my self-talk was like very negative and very nagging and very like berating and rough. And I realized that a lot of that came from like how people had talked to me all my life. And I just kind of assumed that was what I needed to talk to myself as. And then I realized, wait, this is not really resonating with me. This isn't what I need. I need something that's a little bit more gentle, that's more compassionate. So when it does come to those instances, when I do need to like make stuff happen, it's a very gentle voice. Like, okay, let's get with the program. Let's go to the grocery store so you can cook something, so you can get some writing done. So that kind of thing. And that speaks to me more than a voice that is more like negative or berating me. That just doesn't resonate with me personally.
Even in the kind of two examples you gave, it also sounds like that voice is kind of viewing the thing that you're doing as a means to an end, right? Like, I need to take care of myself so I can do this other stuff. I need to go to this grocery store so I can get to this other thing. Do you think that the way you think about self-care or kind of being motivated is about like a means to achieving an end?
Yeah. And I think that's just because of how I think about like completing things, and how my work ethic is very central to me and very innate, very instinctual. So I do kind of think of things as a lot of time as being building blocks, in terms of I take care of myself. I make sure that I'm nurtured, that I feel good, that I'm sleeping well, I have good food. And that enables me to be present in my friendships and my relationships, to enjoy when I'm traveling, to be able to take maybe a couple hours one day and not work and read a book instead. So it's all about the things that build upon each other, and it's all interconnected for me when I think about it.
It also sounds like that approach would make each step less overwhelming, because then you have really one thing you're focusing on at a time.
Right. Exactly.
Has that been your experience, or am I like projecting onto you?
No, I do find that I get really overwhelmed when I think of like deadlines or things that I'm working on. If I think of like the mass of what needs to be completed, then I'm not going to finish it. I'm just going to be like, okay, I'm just going to stay on Twitter for another 3 hours laughing at memes instead of doing work. But if I'm able to break it down in digestible chunks, it makes it a lot easier for me to actually complete it, because like I do it in ways that I don't feel like I'm discounting myself for the fact that I'll be able to do it. Because I think I kind of factor this into like my to-do list. When I make a to-do list, I don't put more than 5 items on it at a time. Because if I put more than 5, then I'm automatically setting myself up to not complete things. And then that sets me back even more, rather than if I give myself kind of like the chance to actually do something that I'll actually be able to do, then that is better for me personally.
That makes a lot of sense. I'm wondering, do your habits translate as you travel, or do you find that your habits change while you're traveling?
No. I'm the exact same no matter where I am in the world. And it's actually really funny to think. I think sometimes initially when I first started traveling, I thought of travel as a means of escape, because I was really unhappy with my life and things that just weren't good. And I wasn't really doing what filled me up and filled me with joy. But now, since I've kind of rebuilt my life into one that fulfills me a lot more deeply, it's not really a means of escape. Travel is not an escape. It's an addition to my life that is already pretty full. So I'm the same wherever I go. Like, I still don't wake up very early, no matter where I am. I still, sometimes if I'm procrastinating, I'll go to the grocery store and spend 4 hours cooking, because that's just what I do. I still work in the evenings, no matter where I am. I'm the same wherever I am.
So does that mean when you're traveling, like, are you often like looking to stay in places where you have access to a kitchen? Does that become important to you?
Yes, absolutely. Absolutely. Like, that's a must. Like, I'm always looking for a kitchen, and not just any kitchen. Like, if the kitchen looks like very like small, isn't a big deal, because when I lived in Madrid, my kitchen was like the size of a half bathroom. I'm not even kidding. And I have no idea. I used to cook fried chicken and macaroni and cheese and biscuits, and I have no idea how I did that, but I mean, I just made it work. But yeah, like it has to be a kitchen that pretty much has stuff in it, because sometimes when I stay in Airbnbs, like, they say they have a kitchen, but literally like there's like one pot, there's no utensils to use in the kitchen, so you end up having to think about buying an entire kitchen on wheels while you're traveling, and that's just not sustainable. So I do screen kitchens.
That's so interesting. No, I mean, I think that a lot of times you're right, that folks not just think of travel, like travel can be like, it's like designated as an escape, right? Like, I'm going to take a break from my life. And it's so interesting both to think about building a life that you want to live in, kind of, but also thinking about how to maintain your life and your routines as you travel. Because I think for me personally, where I get thrown off of self-care habits or routines is when my routine gets disrupted. And it's so fascinating to think about how to find ways to maintain it regardless of where you are or what you're doing.
Yeah, it's a very intentional thing for me, because it takes work. Rather than just like booking stuff like somewhere to stay and, oh, this looks nice, I'm just going to book it. Like, a legitimate process where I'm taking into account a lot of different factors, because I need to kind of have a structure that will work for me long term, because I would say that I'm a slow traveler. So that usually means I prefer to stay somewhere a month at a time at least. So that allows me a lot more time to go a lot more deeper to where I'm going. And with that said, that means that I need to have something that I can live there. Like I'm not just passing through. So it takes a lot more work on the front end, but yeah, it pays off in the end.
Yeah, it must also mean that the cost of traveling, like if you're traveling for a month at a time, in some ways it ends up becoming like less expensive, because often it's like airfare that's like the most expensive where you're going. So you really like milk the time that you are where you are.
Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. And a lot of times when you book Airbnbs for a month at a time, because I know this, I've done it often, they give you discounts when you book for a month at a time. So yeah, it ends up being cheaper in a lot of different ways.
And also probably depending on where you're traveling, the cost of living is probably not super expensive.
Yes. And I intentionally pick places that are not super expensive, because if it is super expensive, it's not sustainable long term. Like, for instance, I really love London, but London is very expensive. So staying there for a month at a time might not be exactly sustainable for me, versus I'm here in Colombia and the cost of living is very low. And so I could stay here. I'm planning to stay here until at least June, but my costs are super, super low. And I feel like it's not, sometimes when you think about costs being a lot less, you feel like you're not getting as much, like you're depriving yourself. I don't know if that makes sense, but like, I feel like here in Colombia, it doesn't feel like that at all. Like it's a lot less, but like you're getting a lot more in return. So it ends up being a much different travel experience. You're really immersing yourself where you are, making yourself a part of the community, versus just passing through.
And so does that mean that when you travel, you really get to know people in addition to getting to know the place?
Yes, that's very important to me, because I feel like the people often are the lifeblood of travel stories. I mean, anyone can write like a 24 hours in Paris guide, and that would be really cool. And it tells you where to go and where to eat, but it doesn't really tell you about the people. And the people are living and breathing entities of stories when you think of travel. And that's always been the most interesting thing to me about stuff. But I guess it's just a personal thing.
No, I think that's right, because I think it can be quite surprising both how differently people live and then also how similarly people live depending on where they are in the world.
Yes. Yes, it really is. You end up being enriched in a lot of different ways, mostly unexpected ways. So it leaves you with a different perspective than when you came in with. And that's kind of the point of travel for me as well.
Have you picked up self-care habits through your travels? Like, do you find that people in other parts of the world do something and you're like, I should try that?
Oh, yes, siesta. And when I lived in Madrid, ever since I lived in Madrid and I noticed that people in the afternoon just stop and sleep, I was like, this is amazing. Like, why don't we do this in the US? So ever since then, like usually sometimes I try to do it like right before, like usually 1 or 2. So that's why I say when I work, it depends on what time, because it depends on when I've taken my nap. So I would stop and take that nap for a couple hours and you have a new lease on life for the rest of the day. Like, it's amazing.
That's so interesting. So the final question I wanted to ask you about is, what is a self-care habit that you are currently working on developing?
I started practicing yoga last October, actually. And that's been very interesting for me. And I started it initially it was one of the main ways that I could actually hold my grief in a way that was digestible for me. Because like I said, it was a huge struggle for me to kind of deal with people having an expectation of how I should be grieving and how long it should take for me to grieve. So going to yoga like a couple days per week, I didn't have an audience of my grief. And that was such an immense relief. So I've been trying to kind of figure out like what types of yoga work for me, resonate with my body especially. And the most interesting thing about yoga is I realized that I wasn't very present in my body. And when I say that out loud, that kind of like, well, duh, most people should be, but I don't think a lot of us are. Like knowing. Can
you explain what that means, present in your body?
Being present in your body, just like listening within the space of what your body says. For instance, if you have like a back pain in a certain place, or if you have a spasm in a certain place, or things like that, I don't think that anything is in isolation. I think everything is interconnected. So a lot of times, for instance, when my upper back or my shoulders is hurting, usually that means that I don't feel emotionally supported. So that's a way for me to kind of frame it. In what ways do I not feel emotionally supported? How can I ask people in my life for more support so I don't feel this way? Usually lower back means I'm stressing out about money. So if I have lower back pains, I know, why am I stressing out about money? Are there affirmations that I can repeat to myself about being safe and protected and me having all of that I need right now? So that's kind of what I mean about being present in my body. And it's been very enlightening because I wasn't really tuned in before. So it's been interesting to kind of tussle through that. And I look forward to what comes out of that as I continue to practice. Hoping to find a studio here in Colombia next week and dive right in again.
It's exciting.
Yeah.
So I think that's a great place to end. I want to thank our listeners for listening to another episode of Self-Care Sundays. Before we wrap up here, I want to offer a special shout out to our patrons on Patreon. Their generosity makes our show possible. We are especially grateful for our super contributors, Vicky B, Renu J, Brady K, Bill S, and Embershot. If you'd like to support the show and hear your name at the end of our episodes, please check out patreon.com/Self-Care Sundays podcast. Again, that's patreon.com/Self-Care Sundays podcast. Also give us a follow on Twitter at Self-Care Sundays and on Facebook at Self-Care Sundays. Do you have any social media handles you'd like to share?
Yes, it's the same on Twitter and Instagram. It's Afros y Paella. So it's the same everywhere. AFROSY and Paella, PAELLA.
Great. I'd like to thank the person who made our podcast art, Leah Horowitz, and the amazing artists who make our show music, For Real City. On behalf of our producer, Jess Talwar, and our audio engineer, Kato Zane, thank you for tuning in today, and we'll see you on our next episode.